Some places do not stay abandoned because they are empty. They stay abandoned because grief still lives there. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe even the loneliest soul deserves one more chance at home, stay with me until the end of this story. Rain hammered the Arkansas countryside like handfuls of gravel thrown from the sky. The old farm sat alone beyond miles of flooded backroads and dying cornfields, its weather-beaten silhouette barely visible beneath flashes of pale lightning. The house looked as though it had been holding its breath for decades. Rotten porch rails sagged toward the mud. Broken shutters clattered softly in the wind. A rusted windmill turned with a long, aching creak that echoed across the empty land like something alive. Caleb Mercer pulled his pickup beside the leaning fence and killed the engine. For a moment, he just sat there in silence, one hand resting on the steering wheel while rain streaked across the windshield in crooked silver lines. Beside him, Ghost lifted his head slowly. The German Shepherd's amber eyes reflected the weak glow from the dashboard. He did not bark. He simply stared at the farmhouse with the stillness of an animal that sensed something deeper than sound. Caleb stepped out into the storm, boots sinking into wet earth. At 42 years old, he still carried the posture of a Navy SEAL even after retirement. Tall, broad shoulders, close-cropped dark blonde hair dampened by rain. A face lined not by age alone, but by years of sleepless nights and memories that refused to stay buried. A faded scar crossed the edge of his jaw beneath several days of stubble. His gray hooded jacket hung heavy against his frame as he walked toward the porch carrying a single duffel bag. Ghost moved beside him without command, paused silent against the soaked boards. The smell hit Caleb first. Wet wood, rushed, mold, and underneath it all, faint but unmistakable, wood smoke. Fresh wood smoke. Caleb stopped halfway to the front door. His eyes narrowed slightly. Nobody was supposed to be living here. The bank records had called the property abandoned for nearly 12 years. The nearest neighbor was over 6 miles away. Yet somewhere beneath the storm and decay, something warm had burned recently. Ghost's ears twitched. Then the dog turned slowly toward the old horse barn, sitting 50 yards behind the house near the edge of the dead cornfield. Lightning flashed again. For half a second, Caleb thought he saw movement near the barn window. A pale shape, gone instantly. He opened the front door carefully. The hinges groaned low and tired. Dust covered nearly every surface inside the farmhouse, but not evenly. There were strange gaps in the dust across the kitchen table, like someone had rested their hands there recently. A ceramic mug sat near the sink. Clean. Caleb stared at it quietly while rain tapped against the cracked windows. Ghost wandered deeper into the house, nails clicking softly across warped floorboards. Then suddenly the dog stopped, completely still. Caleb turned. Ghost stood at the end of a narrow hallway, facing the back of the house. His body had stiffened. His tail lowered slightly. Not fear, recognition. The shepherd released a faint whine deep in his throat and walked toward the rear door leading outside. Caleb followed him onto the covered porch behind the farmhouse. Cold wind swept across the field, carrying the scent of rainwater and distant pine. The barn sat in darkness except for one tiny flicker of amber light near the upper window. A lantern. Ghost stared at it without moving. Then the dog did something Caleb had never seen before. Slowly, almost gently, Ghost lowered himself onto the wet porch boards and rested his head against the door frame facing the barn, as though standing guard over someone unseen in the storm. Caleb felt the weight settle in his chest then. Not danger. Not exactly. Something sadder than that. Somewhere beyond the rain and darkness, someone was still trying to survive inside this forgotten place. Caleb did not sleep that night. The farmhouse groaned constantly beneath the storm, old pipes rattling somewhere inside the walls while cold wind slipped through cracks around the windows. Every sound seemed louder after years of military silence. The ticking of rainwater into a rusted bucket near the staircase. The slow creak of wood settling beneath the roof. The distant hum of thunder rolling across the Arkansas hills like forgotten artillery fading into memory. Ghost stayed near the back door the entire time. The German Shepherd did not pace or bark. He simply watched the barn through the narrow glass pane, as if waiting for permission to move. Around 2 in the morning, Caleb sat at the kitchen table holding a chipped coffee mug he had found in one of the cabinets. The coffee was bitter and weak, but warm enough to keep his hand steady. His eyes drifted toward the faded wallpaper peeling near the ceiling. Someone had once cared about this place. That part was obvious. Even through the decay, traces of life remained everywhere. A child's height marks still scratched beside the pantry doorway. Embroidered curtains yellowed with age. A wooden cross hanging crooked above the stove. Homes did not die all at once. They faded slowly, one memory at a time. Ghost suddenly lifted his head. His ears sharpened toward the ceiling. Caleb froze. Footsteps. Soft. Slow. Above them. Caleb stood carefully from the chair. The old floorboards sighed beneath his weight. He reached instinctively toward his hip before remembering the pistol stayed locked inside the truck outside. Retirement had not erased old habits. Ghost stared toward the staircase now, body tense but strangely calm. Caleb moved toward the steps one at a time. The second floor smelled colder than downstairs, thick with dust and damp wood. Lightning flashed through the cracked hallway window, illuminating faded family photographs hanging crooked against the wall. Caleb stopped beside one frame long enough to study it. A smiling couple standing beside the barn nearly 40 years earlier. Young then, strong. The man wore overalls and held a straw hat against his chest. The woman stood beside him holding a pie dish while sunlight lit her pale hair gold. Caleb stared at the picture longer than he expected. There was something unsettling about seeing joy preserved inside a dying house. Another sound interrupted his thoughts. A cough, weak, human, coming from the far end of the hallway. Ghost moved past Caleb slowly. Now, his paws silent against the floorboards. The shepherd stopped beside a closed bedroom door. Caleb noticed the faint line of warm amber light beneath it. Not electric, softer than that. Lantern light. For several seconds, neither man nor dog moved. Rain battered the roof overhead, while somewhere downstairs the wind pushed against the loose shutters with hollow knocks. Then came a sound again. A fragile cough, followed by a woman's voice speaking softly, almost too quietly to hear. Easy now, Walter. Easy. Caleb felt something tighten behind his ribs. Not fear. Recognition. Loneliness knew loneliness when it heard it. Ghost lowered himself beside the bedroom door and rested his chin across his front paws. Calm. Patient. As though he already trusted whoever waited inside. Caleb exhaled slowly through his nose and knocked once against the wood. Silence followed immediately. The coughing stopped. The room became still enough that Caleb could hear the rainwater dripping from his jacket onto the floorboards. Then finally, from behind the door, an elderly woman spoke with careful caution. Please, she whispered softly. We are not trying to cause trouble. Caleb closed his eyes briefly at the sound of her voice. It carried exhaustion deeper than fear, the kind earned through years of surviving quietly. He looked down at Ghost. The shepherd glanced back at him with steady amber eyes that seemed to say what words could not. Some souls were hiding here because the world had stopped looking for them. Caleb opened the bedroom door slowly enough that the hinges barely made a sound. Warm lantern light spilled into the dark hallway, soft and golden against the peeling wallpaper. The room smelled faintly of old blankets, chicken broth, and cedar smoke. It was the warmest place in the house. An elderly woman stood beside a narrow bed, clutching a worn wool shawl tightly around her shoulders. Her silver hair was braided loosely down one side, and deep lines marked the corners of her pale face like cracks in porcelain. She could not have weighed more than 100 pounds. Yet there was something steady in the way she stood between Caleb and the man resting in bed behind. Her, protective, quietly brave. Ghost stepped into the room first. The German shepherd moved with surprising gentleness, crossing the creaking floorboards until he reached the bedside. The old man lying beneath heavy quilts looked painfully thin beneath the lantern glow. His breathing came rough and uneven, each cough rattling through his chest before fading into exhaustion. Gray stubble shadowed his hollow jaw, and a faded army thermal shirt hung loosely against his frame. One trembling hand rested near the edge of the blanket. Ghost lowered his head and nudged it softly with his nose. The old man opened tired blue eyes and managed the faintest smile. "Well," he whispered weakly, his voice dry as old paper, "that is a fine dog right there." Caleb stayed near the doorway, rainwater still dripping slowly from his jacket onto the wood floor. For several seconds, nobody spoke again. Outside, thunder rolled farther away now, softer than before. The storm was moving east. The woman finally cleared her throat carefully. "My name is Evelyn Hayes," she said quietly. "My husband is Walter." Caleb nodded once. "Caleb Mercer." Her eyes widened slightly at the sound of his name, though she said nothing about it. Instead, she glanced nervously toward the hallway as though expecting him to throw them out immediately. "We never meant any harm," she explained softly. "The bank took the property nearly 11 years ago after Walter got sick. Nobody came back after that, so we stayed." Caleb looked around the room again. It was cleaner than the rest of the farmhouse. Carefully kept. Cans of soup lined one wall beside stacked firewood. An old Bible rested atop a milk crate beside the bed, next to folded reading glasses and a lantern half full of fuel. Someone had fought hard to preserve dignity inside these walls. That mattered to Caleb more than he expected. Walter coughed again and reached shakily toward a ceramic mug near the bed. Before Evelyn could move, Caleb stepped forward and handed it to him. Their fingers brushed briefly. Walter's hands were rough with old scars and years of labor. Farmer's hands. Soldier's hands. "Thank you," Walter murmured. Ghost settled onto the floor, beside the bed with a long sigh, his large body stretched protectively across the worn rug. Evelyn watched the dog carefully. "Animals know things," she said after a moment. "Sometimes before people do." Caleb glanced down at Ghost. The shepherd's amber eyes never left Walter. Not fear, not suspicion, loyalty, as though the dog had already decided this fragile old man belonged under his protection. Evelyn moved toward the small stove near the wall and poured steaming broth into a chipped bowl. The smell filled the room instantly, warm and simple. She hesitated before speaking again. "We can leave in the morning if you want us to." Caleb looked toward the rain-streaked window, where darkness still covered the fields beyond the barn. Then he looked back at Walter struggling just to breathe beneath those blankets. Somewhere deep beneath years of grief and silence, something inside Caleb shifted slightly. Not healed, not even close, but softer than it had been yesterday. "No," he said quietly, "not tonight." Morning arrived slowly over the Arkansas fields, gray lights spreading across the soaked farmland while fog drifted low above the dead corn stalks like smoke from an old battlefield. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the world quiet except for dripping rainwater and a distant cry of crows somewhere beyond the tree line. Caleb stood on the back porch, holding a steaming cup of black coffee between both hands. The cold bit harder now without the rain. Ghost sat beside him, watching the barn with calm alertness, ears twitching every few seconds at sounds too distant for human hearing. For the first time in months, Caleb realized he had slept more than 4 straight hours. Not well, but enough to dream. He hated that. Dreams always brought faces back with them. Men laughing before deployment. The smell of ocean salt near Coronado. A folded flag. Silence afterward. He stared out across the property while pale morning sunlight touched the broken fence posts one by one. The farm stretched wider than he remembered from the bank listing. Nearly 40 acres of exhausted land, overgrown pasture, collapsing sheds, and rusted equipment half swallowed by weeds. Yet, beneath the neglect, there were signs of care everywhere now that daylight exposed them. Firewood stacked neatly beside the barn. Fresh boot tracks near the pump well. A small vegetable patch somehow still alive behind the chicken coop despite the cold. Somebody had refused to let this place die completely. Behind him, the screen door creaked softly. Evelyn stepped onto the porch, carrying a folded blanket over one arm. She moved slowly but carefully, wearing the same faded blue sweater from the night before. Walter finally fell asleep, she whispered. That dog of yours stayed beside him the entire night. Caleb glanced through the doorway. Ghost lifted his head briefly toward Evelyn before returning his attention to the fields. He chooses people carefully, Caleb said quietly. Evelyn smiled faintly at that. Then maybe he sees something good in my husband that the world forgot a long time ago. Caleb did not answer immediately. Forgotten people. He understood those better than most. Evelyn stepped beside him at the porch railing. For several moments, they simply watched the fog move through the fields together. You military? She asked gently after a while. Caleb nodded once. Used to be. Walter was Army medic back in Vietnam. Her voice softened at the memory. He still wakes up apologizing to boys he could not save. Caleb lowered his eyes toward the coffee steaming in his hands. Some wounds never left. They only learned how to speak more quietly over time. Ghost suddenly stood and trotted down the porch steps toward the old barn. Caleb followed him with his eyes. The German shepherd disappeared briefly around the side of the building before returning, carrying something carefully in his mouth. A worn leather glove. Dark brown, cracked with age. Ghost laid it gently at Caleb's boots. Evelyn's breath caught softly beside him. That was Walter's, she whispered. Caleb bent down and picked it up slowly. The leather was weathered smooth from years of labor. On the inside cuff, faded black letters had nearly disappeared with time. Vous, Fayus. Caleb stared at the initials longer than he intended. Ghost sat beside him quietly, tail brushing against the porch boards. Once, the dog looked strangely proud of himself. Evelyn smiled for the first time since Caleb met her. Small, tired, real. Walter lost that glove nearly 3 years ago, she said softly. He searched half the property for it. Caleb looked down at Ghost again. The shepherd's amber eyes seemed warmer in the morning light now. Not just guarding the old man, caring for him. That realization settled deep inside Caleb in a way he could not explain. Somewhere along the years, somewhere between grief and silence, Ghost had learned how to lead broken souls toward each other better than most people ever could. The days settled into an unexpected rhythm after that. Quiet mornings, long afternoons beneath pale Arkansas skies, evenings filled with the smell of simmering soup and crackling firewood drifting through the farmhouse halls. Caleb found himself repairing things without thinking about it. A loose hinge near the kitchen pantry. Broken porch boards softened by years of rain. A leaking pipe beneath the sink that rattled every few hours like an old man clearing his throat. His hands remembered work easier than his mind remembered peace. Ghost followed him everywhere across the property, moving through the fields with patient watchfulness while cold November wind bent the dead grass in slow silver waves. Walter improved slightly each day. Not stronger exactly, but steadier. Some mornings Caleb would find him wrapped in blankets beside the living room window, sipping weak coffee, while sunlight touched the deep lines in his weathered face. Ghost always rested nearby, sometimes with his massive head draped across Walter's boots, as if guarding him from the silence itself. One afternoon, Caleb repaired part of the collapsed fence behind the barn, while Walter sat nearby on an overturned bucket beneath a heavy coat. The old man watched quietly for nearly 20 minutes before finally speaking. You hammer like military, he said with a faint smile. Caleb glanced over his shoulder. There is a military way to hammer. Walter chuckled softly, though the laugh turned into another rough cough halfway through. Everything becomes military after enough years. The wind carried the scent of cedar and wet soil across the pasture. Somewhere far off, crows gathered above the trees in dark spirals. Caleb drove another nail into the fence post. Evelyn said you were a medic. Walter's eyes drifted toward the distant fields. Long time ago. His voice lowered after that, softer somehow. Vietnam changes the shape of a man. Even after he comes home. Caleb understood that sentence too well. Some memories never stopped echoing. Walter stared down at his shaking hands resting atop the cane between his knees. Back then you learned real quick that bravery was not loud. he continued quietly. Usually it looked like some scared 19-year-old trying to carry his friend through the mud while pretending not to cry. Caleb stopped hammering. The old man's words settled heavily in the cold air between them. Ghost approached Walter then, nudging the man's hand gently until trembling fingers disappeared into the thick fur around the shepherd's neck. Walter smiled faintly at the contact. "This dog reminds me of one we had near Da Nang," he murmured. "German shepherd named Lucky. Smartest animal I ever knew. Used to sleep beside wounded soldiers until the helicopters arrived." Caleb leaned against the fence post silently. Ghost closed his eyes beneath Walter's hand, as though he understood every word. The late afternoon sun dipped lower behind the barn, bathing the fields in soft amber light. For a brief moment, the old farm no longer looked abandoned. It looked tired, waiting, still alive. That evening, Evelyn cooked cornbread in an iron skillet blackened with decades of use, while Walter dozed beside the fireplace. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, sharpening an old pocket knife he had found in the barn. Ghost lay stretched across the rug between them all, one ear twitching each time the fire cracked softly. Evelyn glanced toward her sleeping husband and smiled sadly. "He used to sing while working the fields," she whispered. People could hear him half a mile down the road. Caleb looked toward Walter's sleeping figure. It was difficult to imagine the fragile old man as young and strong. But traces remained in the way he carried himself even now. Quiet, dignity, the kind earned through surviving hard years without bitterness. Evelyn placed the skillet onto the table carefully. "You know," she said softly, "Walter kept this place alive because he believed someday somebody good would come back for it." Caleb lowered the pocket knife slowly into his lap. Before he could answer, Ghost suddenly lifted his head toward the hallway. The shepherd stood at once and trotted toward the staircase with unusual urgency. Caleb frowned slightly and followed him. Halfway up the stairs, Ghost stopped beside the old hallway closet and pawed once against the door. The hallway felt colder than the rest of the farmhouse. Weak evening light filtered through the dusty window at the far end, turning the faded wallpaper the color of old smoke. Ghost remained motionless beside the closet door, staring at it with complete focus. His ears stood tall, his tail lowered slightly. Caleb had learned long ago that the shepherd never reacted without reason. "What is it?" he murmured quietly. Ghost pawed the door once more. Slow, deliberate. Caleb reached for the tarnished brass knob and twisted carefully. The door groaned inward several inches before sticking against something inside. A dry scent of cedar, dust, and old paper drifted into the hallway. Caleb pushed harder until the door finally opened enough to reveal stacks of boxes piled almost to the ceiling. Most were covered with blankets, yellowed by time. Others were marked with faded black lettering nearly erased by age and moisture. Walter Hayes, Medical Corps, property of United States Army. Caleb stared silently into the cramped space while Ghost stepped inside first. The dog moved carefully between the boxes until he stopped near the back wall, beside an old wooden chest bound with rusted metal corners. He sat beside it immediately, waiting. Caleb crouched down and brushed dust from the lid. The chest looked decades old, scarred with scratches and water stains. One leather strap still hung from the side, cracked nearly through with age. He hesitated briefly before lifting the lid. Inside rested fragments of another lifetime. Folded uniforms, black and white photographs curled at the edges, medical patches sewn by hand, several unopened letters tied carefully together with faded blue ribbon. Beneath them all lay a worn army medic helmet with a dark red cross painted across the front. Caleb picked up one of the photographs slowly. Young soldiers stood smiling beside a riverbank somewhere overseas. Muddy boots, thin faces, exhausted eyes pretending not to be afraid. Walter stood near the center, looking no older than 22. Strong back then, alive in a way war had not yet stolen from him. Ghost nudged something gently beneath the photographs with his nose. Caleb moved the papers aside and uncovered a small leather pouch tucked deep inside the chest. The moment he touched it, he noticed how carefully worn the edges were, as though somebody had opened it thousands of times over the years. He loosened the drawstrings slowly. Inside rested several military dog tags, tangled together by age. Caleb froze the instant he saw one familiar name stamped into the dull metal. Thomas Mercer. His breath caught sharply in his throat. The hallway around him seemed to disappear into silence. Rainwater dripped somewhere downstairs. Floorboards creaked softly in the wind. But Caleb heard almost nothing beyond the pounding of his own heartbeat. His father's name. Ghost looked up at him quietly from beside the chest. Caleb lifted the tag with trembling fingers. The chain was old, rusted in places, but unmistakable. Thomas Mercer had been dead nearly 14 years. Caleb had buried him with military honors beneath cold January rain, while strangers folded flags and spoke words that sounded rehearsed. Yet somehow his father's dog tags were here, hidden inside a forgotten farmhouse closet in Arkansas. Caleb stood abruptly and turned toward the staircase. "Walter," he called, louder than intended. Downstairs, silence followed for several seconds before he heard the slow scrape of a chair against wood. Caleb descended the stairs, gripping the dog tags tightly in his hand, while Ghost stayed close behind him. Walter sat near the fireplace, wrapped in his heavy blanket, his pale face illuminated by flickering firelight. The old man looked toward Caleb calmly at first. Then his eyes landed on the tags. Everything inside him seemed to stop. Walter's weathered hand tightened slowly around the armrest beside him. His lips parted slightly as recognition spread across his exhausted face like the return of a ghost long buried. Evelyn looked between them both in confusion. "Walter," she whispered softly. The old medic never answered her. His eyes remained fixed on the tags, shaking gently in Caleb's hand. And when he finally spoke, his voice sounded fragile enough to break. "Thomas Mercer," he whispered. "Dear God." The fire crackled softly in the living room while nobody moved for several long seconds. Walter stared at the dog tags in Caleb's hand as though time itself had folded backward around him. The old man's pale eyes filled slowly with something deeper than surprise. Grief, memory, relief. Evelyn rested one trembling hand against his shoulder, confused and worried by the sudden change in him. Ghost settled quietly beside Walter's chair, watching both men with calm attention. Caleb stepped closer to the firelight and held out the tags carefully. "These belong to my father," he said quietly. "How do you have them?" Walter reached for the chain with shaking fingers. The moment the cold metal touched his palm, his shoulders sagged slightly beneath the weight of years. He closed his eyes, because I promised him I would keep them safe until he came home. The room fell silent except for the pop of burning cedar in the fireplace. Walter swallowed hard before speaking again. "Your father was 24 when I met him," he whispered. "Skinny kid from Oklahoma who laughed too loud and carried photographs of his wife everywhere he went." Caleb's chest tightened instantly. His mother had died when he was 16. He still remembered those old photographs sitting inside cigar boxes in the garage. Walter stared into the flames while memories seemed to pull him somewhere far away beyond the farmhouse walls. "We were stationed near the Mekong Delta," he continued softly. "Rain every day, mud everywhere. Young boys pretending to be brave because nobody wanted the others to see them scared." His voice weakened briefly before continuing. "Your father got separated from his unit during an evacuation after flooding hit our camp. Water rose fast that night. Pitch black outside. I found him half conscious, tangled beneath debris near the riverbank." Caleb lowered himself slowly into the chair across from him without even realizing he had moved. Walter rubbed his thumb across the worn dog tags carefully. "Thomas thought he was dying," he said. "He kept apologizing because he believed his wife would raise you alone." Caleb felt his throat tighten sharply at those words. Ghost rested his heavy head gently against Caleb's knee beneath the table. Warm, steady, present. Walter looked toward Caleb, then, with exhausted eyes clouded by memory. "I carried him nearly 2 miles through waist-deep water before the helicopters arrived at dawn." A faint smile touched the old medic's lips. Your father stayed awake the whole time talking about you. Said he had a little boy back home with his mother's eyes. Caleb stared down at the floorboards, unable to speak. Somewhere deep inside him, walls built over decades began cracking quietly apart. Walter leaned slowly toward the side table beside his chair and opened the bottom drawer with trembling effort. From inside, he removed a small waterproof pouch worn nearly white at the seams. He handed it toward Caleb carefully. Thomas gave me this before we separated stateside, he whispered. Told me if anything happened to him, I should make sure his son got it someday. Caleb opened the pouch slowly beneath the firelight. Inside rested a faded photograph of a young woman holding a baby wrapped in blue blankets. His mother. Him. Behind it lay a folded letter stained dark at one corner from old water damage. Caleb unfolded the paper with shaking hands. The handwriting was unmistakable. His father's. For my son, the first line read. Caleb closed his eyes instantly as emotion struck him hard enough to steal his breath. Across the room, Evelyn quietly covered her mouth with trembling fingers while Walter watched in silence. Ghost pressed closer against Caleb's leg without making a sound. Outside, cold Arkansas wind moved gently through the fields beyond the farmhouse. But inside that broken, old house, beneath soft firelight and the steady breathing of a loyal dog, a promise carried across 40 years had finally found its way home. Winter arrived gently across the Arkansas countryside after that night. Frost gathered along the fence lines each morning, turning the fields silver beneath the rising sun, while smoke curled steadily from the farmhouse chimney for the first time in years. The old place no longer felt forgotten. It breathed again. Caleb spent the following weeks rebuilding more than broken wood. He repaired the barn roof before the first hard freeze arrived, replaced shattered windows with salvage glass from a supply yard 40 miles away, cleared brush, choking the dirt road so deliveries could finally reach the property again. His hands stayed busy from sunrise until dark, but something inside him had changed now. The silence no longer felt empty. Ghost worked beside him through every task like a quiet shadow, with amber eyes and frost gathering along his thick sable fur each morning. The German shepherd seemed happiest whenever Walter sat outside, wrapped in blankets, watching the repairs unfold. Sometimes the old medic would offer advice in his gravelly voice from the porch swing. Other times, he simply watched Caleb work with the soft expression of a man, seeing hope return to a place he once believed would die with him. Evelyn filled the house with warmth that winter, bread cooling beside the stove, old hymns humming softly from the kitchen while soup simmered through the afternoons. She cleaned every room slowly, carefully uncovering pieces of the farmhouse buried beneath dust and loneliness. One evening, Caleb returned from town, carrying several heavy bags of supplies through the front door. Ghost trotted proudly behind him with a sack of dog food clenched gently between his teeth. Evelyn laughed quietly at the sight. That dog thinks he owns this place now. Caleb glanced toward Ghost lying beside the fireplace moments later, tail thumping softly against the rug. Maybe he always did, he answered. Walter's health remained fragile, but the color slowly returned to his face. Fresh air helped. Warm meals helped. But more than anything, being seen again seemed to bring him back to life piece by piece. Some nights Caleb would sit beside him near the fire while they spoke quietly about military life, old mistakes, and a strange guilt carried by men who survived longer than they expected to. Walter once looked toward Ghost sleeping between them and murmured softly, "Funny how dogs never care what a man used to be. They only care who he is when he comes home." Caleb never forgot that sentence. By early December, word about the farmhouse spread quietly through nearby towns. A retired truck driver donated lumber after hearing about the elderly couple living there. A widow from Benton County delivered quilts she had sewn herself. One local veterinarian arrived with free medicine for Walter and spent nearly an hour scratching Ghost behind the ears while pretending not to cry. The property slowly transformed into something larger than shelter. It became a place where forgotten things were allowed to matter again. One snowy afternoon, Caleb found Ghost standing near the edge of the property, beside an old wooden sign half buried beneath weeds. The letters had nearly disappeared with age. Caleb knelt beside it and brushed away dirt carefully with his gloves until the faded carving became visible once more. Hayes Family Farm. Ghost sat beside him quietly while snow drifted through the cold air around them. Caleb stared at the sign for a long moment before driving it firmly back into the ground where it belonged. That night, after Walter fell asleep beside the fire and Evelyn finished washing dishes in the kitchen, Caleb remained alone on the porch wrapped in his heavy coat. Snow covered the fields now, soft and untouched beneath moonlight. Ghost rested beside his boots, breathing slowly into the cold. Caleb unfolded his father's old letter once more beneath the porch light. Near the end, one sentence caught his eye harder than before. If life ever breaks you apart, son, find people worth rebuilding with. Caleb lowered the letter slowly and looked back toward the warm glow spilling from the farmhouse windows behind him. For the first time in many years, he realized he was no longer searching for a place to disappear. He had finally found a place to stay. By late January, snow rested softly across the Arkansas fields like a clean blanket laid over old scars. The farmhouse windows glowed warm against the winter dusk, their golden light visible nearly half a mile down the road now. People had started calling the property Mercy Farm, without anyone officially naming it. Somehow the name simply stayed. Caleb never argued with it. Some mornings began before sunrise with the smell of coffee drifting through the kitchen while Ghost waited patiently near the porch for Walter to wake. The old medic had grown thinner through the winter, but his eyes carried peace now instead of fear. He spent hours wrapped in blankets beside the fireplace, telling stories that wandered slowly between memory and silence. Sometimes Evelyn listened while knitting near the window. Sometimes Caleb listened without speaking at all. And sometimes Ghost rested between them like the final thread holding broken years together. One bitterly cold evening, heavy snow began falling just after sunset. Wind pushed softly against the farmhouse walls while cedar logs crackled inside the stone fireplace. Caleb returned from the barn, carrying extra blankets over one shoulder. The scent of beef stew filled the house. Evelyn hummed an old church hymn quietly from the kitchen, while Walter slept in his armchair beneath the glow of the fire. Ghost lay stretched across the rug beside him, one paw resting gently against the old man's boot as though making certain he remained there. Caleb paused in the doorway for a long moment, just watching them. The sight hit him harder than any battlefield memory ever had. Peace, real peace. Not the temporary kind found in empty whiskey bottles or motel rooms off forgotten highways. This was quieter, holier somehow, the kind that arrived slowly after enough suffering had softened people back into kindness. Walter stirred awake a few minutes later and glanced toward the snow beyond the windows. "Beautiful night," he murmured weakly. Caleb nodded. "Storm is supposed to last until morning." Walter smiled faintly beneath the blanket. "Good. Means everybody stays home tonight." Evelyn brought bowls of stew to the table, while Ghost lifted his head hopefully at the smell. Caleb chuckled softly and tossed the shepherd a small piece of cooked beef. Ghost caught it gently without ever taking his eyes off Walter. Evelyn noticed and smiled. That dog still watches him like a guardian angel. Caleb glanced toward Ghost quietly. Maybe he is one. After dinner, Walter motioned weakly for Caleb to help him onto the porch. Snowflakes drifted slowly through the pale porch light, while cold wind whispered across the sleeping fields. Ghost followed close beside them, his dark coat dusted white almost instantly beneath the snowfall. Walter lowered himself carefully into the old porch swing with Caleb's help and stared out at the property in silence. The barn stood repaired now, fence posts straight again. Smoke curled steadily from the chimney into the winter sky. Life had returned here. Walter's tired blue eyes glistened faintly as he looked across the land he once believed would vanish forgotten into the earth. "You know," he whispered softly, "I spent years praying somebody good would find this place after I was gone." Caleb rested both hands against the porch railing, staring out at the snow beside him. Maybe the place found me instead. Walter smiled at that. Ghost moved beside the old medic then and gently rested his head across Walter's knee. The old man buried trembling fingers into the thick sable for one final time. No fear remained in his face now, only gratitude. Warm lights spilled from the farmhouse windows behind them, while snow continued falling across the quiet Arkansas fields. And in that small, sacred moment, surrounded by broken people who had somehow rebuilt one another, Caleb finally understood something his father had tried to tell him all those years ago. Some homes are not inherited. They are rescued. And sometimes God sends a dog ahead first to lead you there.